two things to mention. One is that several people have suggested that I go back and revisit traveling on the contemporary Silk Road. And I'm going to do that. And there's a handout at the back of the room, the schedule for that. I'm going to do a series of 5 talks that basically pretend like we're taking a tour now. And I'm going to go the same direction. I'm going to start in China and then finish up in Central Asia. So I'm not going to try to go to any further west than Turkmenistan. But basically talking a bit more about, if you were doing it now, what you would see and what some of the social and political issues are, particularly in Central Asia, but in China as well. Well, in China and Central Asia, contemporary, currently. Another thing, Gail Baker has offered to make this book available outside her room, apartment 415. And this is basically about landscape painting that talks about a lot about Dunhuang that I will be talking about today. I'm going to focus more on the Buddhist religious figures and the sculpture and so on, but bring in a little landscape. So she has offered to make that book available. We talked about some of the kinds of goods that were going along the Silk Road. And today I want to close out by talking more about some of the ideas. And some of these have been implicit in what we've talked about before, but I want to close by talking about, what kinds of things were being transmitted along the Silk Road from the point of view of basically 3 perspectives. One is religion, the second is art.
Give it a wiggle.
Give it a wiggle.
Oh dear.
I don't want to be there. Wiggle a little bit. Macau, would you turn off the lights?
That's fine.
You don't like it that way?
Yeah.
Okay. So anyhow, religion, art, and science. And I want to recapitulate and talk about the importance of cultural and political interactions as they're occurring, with a lot of the focus being on the history of the Silk Road is a history of interaction of cultures. And we focused a lot on trade, but there were a lot of things other than trade. The slide points out that some of the most striking evidence for historical interactions can be found in South Central Asia and Afghanistan. The area that was at that time called Bactria, or one time called Bactria, because that's kind of the western point of the Silk Road where things are coming together. And I've talked a lot about what was happening in Samarkand, but to a large degree, from an artistic point of view, the actions or the outcome of Alexander's exploits there introduced into first the area around Afghanistan, but secondly up into Central Asia, Greek culture. And we see that influencing what's happening from an artistic point of view over a very large area, but there's an interaction with the local traditions. So as the successors to Alexander in Bactria declined, then the leaders from other nomadic groups who were coming in from the north and the northwest Asia assumed control. So originally strong influence from Greece, but then movement of peoples in and down from the north and the east. And central here, as I talked about when we discussed some of the major groups, was the Kushan Empire. And the Kushans really were responsible for a lot of that synthesis of Greek art with the local Central Asian and Indian traditions, because Kushan comes up from the south, from India, Bactria and Parthia from the west, and then the steppe empires and the Sogdians from the northeast. So let's talk about religion. I'm going to talk about 4 religions, or 5 actually. First I want to talk about Zoroastrianism. This was a religion that was founded on the teachings of Persian prophet Zoroaster. He's also known as Zarathustra, and there's a famous work of music called Thus Spake Zarathustra. But Zarathustrism is based on a duality between good and evil, and it predicts that ultimately, who knows when that is, evil will be defeated by good. The supreme deity in the religion was Ahura Mazda, associated with the sun, and whose earthly representation was fire. Although it was a nominally monotheistic religion, other figures from earlier times in Mesopotamia and in India became part of the pantheon, the group of gods of Zarathustraism. The Sogdians inserted one of their goddesses, the form goddess Nana, and for them that was one of the most important figures in the religion. This is the symbol. There's the god there over the winged eagle, and this is common in Persia and then on into east of there. This is the Sogdian goddess Nana. 4 arms. It's a little hard to see in this old fresco, but anyhow, this was a Central Asian Sogdian representation of one of the goddesses. As some of you probably know, one of the characteristic practices of Zoroastrians was the exposure of the dead. They did not believe in burying the dead because they were concerned that it would pollute the earth. So what they did was basically took bodies into what are called towers of silence, where the bones were picked by scavenger birds. Then in Transoxiana at least, clean bones were retrieved, taken out of the Tower of Silence, stored in ceramic or stone ossuaries. And in addition, the symbol of purity was fire, and fire altars were maintained with a continuously burning flame. Some of these were maintained as temple buildings, but many of them were converted into mosques after the Muslims came in. So this is pre-Muslim. This is early in the first millennium. Here's 2 towers of silence. Here's a contemporary one in Persia here. Here's an ancient one in Turkmenistan here. So basically bodies would be placed in there, and they'd come back about a year later, collect the bones. The bones would then be placed in something like this, a stone ossuary. Here's a couple of representative examples. Here's a fire altar here, and I think also here for representations of fire altars. Here's one on an old coin, and here's one from an archaeological excavation. This was the official religion of Persia from the time of Cyrus and Darius, that is, from the time of Alexander's conquest, and then during the Sasanian period from about the 3rd to the 7th centuries. Interestingly, it was a predominant religion in Sogdiana, that is the Sogdians, during about that same time, and the religion was carried to Xi'an by Sogdians. Remember how important these were as middlemen moving back and forth between East and West. And Sogdian merchants who were practicing Zoroastrians in if they died in Shan or wherever, rather than bury them, they would be placed on basically a platform within a tomb. And so that if they're in one of these old Chinese burial mounds or tombs, that there was a couch where their body would be placed. So again, to prevent it from contaminating the earth. Zoroastrianism is still practiced in some parts of the world. There is a Zoroastrian temple in Baku, Azerbaijan, with a continuing growing flame, a fire altar. My understanding is that the Parsis in India also practice Zoroastrianism, or if not Zoroastrianism, a number of the traditions from that, including the importance of fire. So we've got the Zoroastrians originating in Persia. Another important group were Nestorian Christians. And on the Silk Road, there were several Christian groups, but the predominant ones, other than some of the Franciscan missionaries and so on that I talked about when I talked about travelers, the predominant practice of Christianity was this Nestorian Christianity. Some of you probably are biblical scholars and know the history of Christianity better than I. But Nestorius was the Patriarch of Constantinople from about 428 to 431, and held the belief that Christ, in fact, was two separate entities, one human, one divine, in the same body. So as opposed to God being three parts, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, the Nestorians combined basically the God Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and the human spirit or body in one entity. The Council of Ephesus, which set a lot of the guidelines and standards for the early church, said no, you can't do that. It doesn't fit with what we think. Nestorius was condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and he then left and moved to the east into Sasanian Persia, and then there was another church there, a Syrian church, the Church of the East, and they merged with and then dominated this Church of the East and kept going east. And the Saugians, being the intermediaries that we were and accepting a lot of change, became Nestorians. And they carried this religion with them on in their trading missions. And there's evidence that this form of Christianity had reached the eastern end of the Tower Basin by the end of the 7th or early 8th century. So if you keep in mind the Terran Basin, the eastern end of that would be around Dunhuang, which we'll talk about a little bit later from an artistic point of view. Well, one of the things at Dunhuang that I'm going to talk about, and I've mentioned before, is the library cave. And among the thousands of documents recovered at the library cave are Nestorian texts. And from a Chinese perspective, Nestorian Christianity, like Buddhism, had been brought from the West, and both focused on the moral teachings of a great spiritual leader. I'm going to talk about Buddhism later because of its tremendous impact. We've talked about that before. So it moved to the east. The Nestorian belief held rebirth in heaven for faithful believers. Its practitioners established communities and trading posts all across the Silk Road to the east of the Terran Basin, and eventually made it to the Tang capital of Xi'an. There is a Nestorian monument in Xi'an erected in 781 with inscriptions in Chinese at the top and Syrian at the bottom. And that's what you see here. This is a drawing from the time, Tang Dynasty time, of Nestorian Christians there in Xi'an. In addition, in Xi'an, there are Christian tombstones, both of these and representing the tombs of Nestorian Christians in that, well, at that time was the capital of the Tang Dynasty. Another important religion that traveled from west to east, and it's interesting that religions traveled west to east and not east to west. So everything that we're talking about is moving from someplace, either India, the Middle East, or Central Asia, into China, as opposed to religion going out from China to the west. So goods traveled from China to the west. Religion, at least, traveled from the west to the east. It's kind of an interesting concept. So the third of the major religions in the Silk Road is Nestorian, or Manichaeism, founded by a prophet Mani, who was born in Iraq in 2006. Sorry, not 2016. He just didn't get off the bus. 2016, and he saw a new religion that kind of took the major religions that preceded it, that is Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Jesus. He completed the teachings of those leaders, along with elements from India. So it was a very syncretic religion. It had the dualistic nature of good, the light, the good and the spiritual were opposed to dark, evil, and material. It arose in the first half of the 3rd century and prospered into the 7th century in Western Eurasia. And again, it was spread by Sogdian traders. It made it as far as Xinjiang and became the state religion of the Uyghurs in 763. We haven't talked that much about the Uyghurs, but they were a major nomadic group that moved from down into the western regions of what is now China, and were the predominant ethnic group there. And we'll spend a lot of time, when I come back and revisit the current Silk Road, talking about Uyghurs. Interestingly, although most of us have probably never heard of it, at the time, it was probably the most widely spread geographic religion in the world. And it was based on the teachings of the prophet Mani. This is Mani. And these are some of his teachers, religious leaders. Again, religious leaders here. Similar to this one. The symbolism of the food that is represented both there and there. Yeah?
The first slide you showed had writing at the bottom, the portrait of money. Yeah, what is the language?
I would assume that's Farsi. I think it's Persian. He was born in Iraq, so it's either Arabic or Persian. They use the same. Farsi uses the same writing style as Arabic. Well, the big player early on in the Silk Road, of course, was Buddhism. And it originated in India, moved into China, and I've talked a lot about how merchants carried Buddhism with them along the trade the Cushion trade routes to cities east of the Tarim Basin. Keep in mind the orientation of the Tarim Basin. At the west end is Kashgar, at the east end, or just past the east end, is Dunhong. Under the patronage of merchants, monasteries grew, and new monasteries were founded all along the trade routes of the Silk Road. There was a new form, and I don't know that much about Buddhism. Some of you may, but there was a new form of Buddhism that developed called Maharana, and the changes that were introduced by that appealed to merchants. Keep in mind, now we've got merchants that are carrying ideas along with the goods, but we've also got missionaries. But merchants were important because they provided funds to support the things like the development of monasteries, and as you'll see in a minute, the caves in Dunhong. Basic to Buddhism is this process of reincarnation. There was a stage that didn't quite reach nirvana, a stage of paradise of the, and this is, sometimes you see words and you've never heard them pronounced. Well, this is for me one of those words. Okay? The Bodhisattvas, or Hastvas. Does anybody know how to pronounce that right?
Bodhisattvas.
Bodhisattvas?
Bodhisattvas.
Bodhisattva.
Yeah. Bodhisattvas.
Got it. Bodhisattva. Okay, thank you. Like I say, it's one of those things that if you mispronounce a word, at least you read it someplace. Okay. Well, key here was the fact that merit could be gained by donation to monasteries. There were basically 7 treasures that were on donation gained you merit. The 7 treasures were gold, silver, lapis, red coral, silk, pearls, and other jewels. And according to this form of Buddhism, the historic Buddha was simply one incarnation of a series of past and future Buddhas, all of whom could be portrayed in statuary and painting. So unlike Islam, what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, in Islam you couldn't portray Muhammad, but in Buddhism you could portray Buddha, and Buddha was a very important figure, as you'll see when we look at some of the aspects of art. This map shows the transmission of Buddhism coming from India up. Here's the Kushan Empire, remember? Here's Sogdiana up here. But routes coming up through here into Central Asia, and then on into, here's Kashgar, here's the Tarim Basin. So basically spreading this way up and then on into Xi'an. This shows some of the major sites in Buddha's life. And so pilgrims would come down from Central Asia, come in, Buddhist monks and scholars, as I talked about before, when I talked about travelers on the Silk Road, would come down to get manuscripts, to spend time in monasteries, to better understand how Buddhists lived in the heartland of their religion. This is a representation of Buddha that no longer exists. This is one of the colossal Buddhas at Benyam that was blown up by the Taliban. But this was one that several of the monks visited, as I pointed out when we talked about monks traveling on their journeys. Here's one of those things. 2 of them. They're a level below Buddha, but they live in this paradise. And they're very important figures when we get into Buddhist art. You can see, Was there a comment or question?
That's Kuan Yin. Her name is Kuan Yin.
Kuan Yin?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I thought that was her name. Okay, I'll take your word for it. This one's Indian.
They're both work, they're different languages.
They're different languages. So she's got, this is Indian, this is Chinese.
Kuan Yin is Chinese.
Kuan Yin is the Chinese, okay. See, I need a Buddhist scholar to help me out. I've asked for that before, so I'm glad you're here. Okay, but here's a couple of others that are interesting, because if you look at these, you'll see, well, look at these, go back and look at these, the difference in the style. These show that Greco influence. This is from Kandahar up in northern India, actually it's now Pakistan, I think. But a different artistic style, similar kinds of figures in a very different artistic style. I pointed out merchants carried Buddhism. Here you can see this is a petroglyph, a stone engraving that shows merchants going back to Central Asia. And this is an interesting one because you can see here's a Buddha figure, and you can see that around here are people of a variety of different ethnic groups. And these were merchants who acted to carry Buddhist traditions back to the lands from which they came. The last big religion to spread into the area of the Silk Road was Islam. And you can see Islam, as you know, originated here and spread. It's interesting that this figure shows up to 750. What happened in 751? The Battle of the Talas River. And that's in 751. That stopped the spread of Islam and the Chinese. That was the battle between the Islamic forces and Chinese forces that basically pushed the Chinese back into China and stopped the Arabs right up in here. So that's basically the extent of the empire. The Talas River site where the battle was right up there. Well, as probably most of you know, Islam grew out of nomadic Bedouin populations in the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad, the prophet, beginning in 610, received revelations from the angel Gabriel. These revelations led to the foundation of Islam and the writing of the Quran. Muhammad was the last of the prophets, if you will. And the Muslims became the third people of the book. First people of the book, the Jews. Second people of the book, the Christians. Third people of the book, the Muslims. Muhammad established the 5 pillars of Islam. And one of those pillars is daily prayer. In other words, there's one God but Allah. In other words, that Muhammad is his prophet. In other words, is the feast of Ramadan, and the last is to give alms to the poor. And we'll come back to talk about some of those when we talk about the religious architecture of Islam. Following the death of Muhammad, there was a split. That split continues today. They had to do with the succession to the caliphate. The caliph is the religious and spiritual leader and the political leader of Islam. And there are 2 groups, the Shia and the Sunni, and it's based on who gets to be the caliph. And a lot of the tension you see in the Middle East comes from the fact that the Persians are one group and Iraqis are another. And so there's a little tension that developed early on, continues. Well, Islam expanded both to the east and to the west, or the west and the east, as it points out here. And it basically became the large, it wasn't so much an empire as it was a civilization that was united by religious beliefs. A very vast multicultural empire characterized by cultural and linguistic synthesis based on the teachings of Muhammad and based on the Quran. Largest civilization, Dar al-Salam. And the leaders of the early Islamic movement were the Umayyads, and they had their capital in Damascus. They were overcome, defeated by the Abbasids, moved the capital to Baghdad. And then during the golden age of Islam, important growth in literature, science, and commercial networks. And so the Muslims basically took over control of the Silk Road following their expansion into Central Asia and then on to the edges of China. Well, what do we see from the point of view of the influences of Islam? As I pointed out, there's a single cultural sphere, this Dar al-Salam, that extended basically from the Western Mediterranean, that is Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, the Maghreb, into China with extensions into Xi'an. It had yeah.
I'm wondering what year we are at when you're talking about this.
We're talking about the major expansion. We're talking about the 600s and 700s.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so it had a profound influence. The expansion was there, and then it basically stayed in place. Maybe I should make that clear. Once it was there, it remained there. So the expansion was in the 6th and 7th century, but it continues to be there now. So it basically is historical precedent for the last 1,200 years. Does that make sense? So it's there now. That's the religion that's there now. Throughout this whole Asia, throughout this whole area. And it had a profound influence on culture and trade across this broad band. And an interesting thing about Islamic culture is that it incorporated elements from the traditions of the areas into which the Arabs expanded. Byzantine architecture, mosaics in Persia, and Indian literary themes. So it was based on the teachings of Muhammad, based on the principles outlined in the Quran, and then incorporated from the point of view of art and architecture what was happening on the ground in the places to which it expanded. The beliefs were also then spread by the nomads of Central Asia, and as I pointed out a couple of minutes ago, basically Islamic merchants dominated the Silk Road all the way into Asia, into China. So they replaced the Sogdians as the major merchant group, and we find Islamic commercial settlements in Xi'an, the Tang capital. So the broad expansion. There are 4 things that characterize the Islamic expansion and Islam in all the way from the Middle East into Central Asia and China. These are what I call 4 M's: mosques, madrasas, minarets, and mausoleums. To begin with mosques, The mosque on the left is in Samarkand. The mosque on the right is the Friday Mosque in Bukhara. Typical of mosques are two internal structures, the mihrab and the mimbar. The mihrab is a notch in the wall. It varies in size. This is a very nice one with some beautiful tile work. That's the side of Mecca. That's the side you face during prayer. The mimbar is where the sermon is preached. So these are two characteristics of the interior of the mosque. The madrasa is a school for Islamic learning, and this is Rajasthan in Samarkand, 1, 2, 3 madrasas, and this is a close-up of the entrance to I think this one here. Those are schools of Islamic learning. The madrasa, I should have a different sequence. Minarets, you find minarets with a mosque. This is in Turpan, in China. This is in Bukhara, in Uzbekistan. The minaret basically provided a place for the Muslim to climb to announce the daily call for prayer. Prayer 5 times a day. Now it's done with a loudspeaker, but back in the good old days, 5 times a day, the Muslim would climb up to do the call for prayer. If you've ever been in an Islamic country and heard the call for prayer, it's a very interesting phenomenon. The time I remember best was when I was in Fez in Morocco. I was staying in a hotel up on the hill above the Medina, the old city, and the early morning call for prayer came up out of the valley, and with probably about 5 or 6 at least mosques with the Muslim, with this chorus of voices coming out, basically out of the valley below. So the fourth thing, from an architectural point of view, is the mausoleum. This is one in Bukhara. This is a series of mausolea in Samarkand. This is the one I pointed out when I talked about Bukhara that was buried and was not destroyed by Genghis Khan when he came through. But that is all brickwork. And the inside, I was asked what it was, it's really incised plaster. This is a series outside of Samarkand and is said to represent some of the best Timurid architecture in the world. These are simply showing some Arabic inscriptions on stone and coffin. So let's talk about art. The arts have intersected in a number of ways with the history of trade, importantly influenced by religion, exploration and conquest all along the Silk Road. The arts that we find are, to a large degree, expressions of religious ideas that moved across the Silk Road and are really essential to trying to understand the history and practices along the Silk Road. And art objects themselves were important trade commodities. Chinese art was importantly influenced by foreign considerations. Contact with foreign lands had a major impact on Chinese art, 2 major reasons. One was inspiration from the outside world. The second was to produce items that the outside world would want to buy. Many of the figures that we see from the Tang Dynasty show this foreign influence. There are figures, guys with big noses and beards. Yeah, Susan's laughing. And many artists created figurines that depicted gods, prophets, and saints of foreign cultures. So there was this confluence. But the key place that I want to talk about with regard to art in the Silk Road is a place called Dunhuang. Here, it's right here. Here is Xi'an down here. Here's our friend the Tarim Basin. Dunhuang, as you may recall from when I talked about the cities along the Silk Road, is an oasis town here. Here's the Taklamakan, this is the Tarim Basin, and here's the Gobi Desert here. And the art that I'm going to talk about is from the caves of Dunhuang. Dunhuang became the site of the largest complex of Chinese art, the Mangao Caves. They're in the desert, the Gobi Desert, about 25 kilometers from the city. And the caves there span a period of about 1,000 years, basically going from the 4th to the 14th centuries, and visually represent the culture of medieval Chinese civilization. Here's the Gobi, here's the oasis, and here are the caves along this side here. And now there's a lot of people that go there. Number one of the top tourist attractions in China, probably second only to the Terracotta Warriors. This shows the caves. There's three major forms of art at Dunhuang: painting, sculpture, and architecture. And the patrons of the caves, which are predominantly merchants, demonstrated their social status, religious feelings, and economic power, political ideology, by determining the size of the cave and choosing the motifs. So basically the donors chose what was going to be represented and how. In terms of the cave art, there are Buddhist sutras, portraits of donors, decorative patterns. I should include their landscape, as pointed out in Gail's book, Daoist figures and mythological figures, asparas and musical goddesses. These are little winged creatures that fly around. But the caves themselves, the Buddhist icons are the main theme that are represented in the cave art. The Buddhas, whatever those are, that may help me with. Buddhist disciples, heavenly kings, protective warriors. So these are the Buddhist icons, but there are also patrons and so on. I'm going to go quickly through some of these just as a representative. This is one of the caves you can see here, painting the frescoes, the statuary, and so on. It's a remarkable place. The figures, you can barely see some of the winged figures up here, but this is fresco, this is sculpture. Tantric figures, a figure there, gold figure there. Landscape with and without animals. Statuary, there's 400 caves. Most of them are now closed. They rotate them, which ones are open, which ones are closed. But one of the things that's interesting about this one is if you look, each of these figures looks like it represents a different ethnicity. This looks to me either Thai or Japanese, probably Indian, Chinese, but you see the variety there. One of the things that happened, this is a group of merchants meeting a monk. This is one of the wall paintings. One of the things that happened with the movement of Islam is that a number of the figures were defaced. Keep in mind that in Islamic culture, you cannot represent human figures. And so when some of the Islamic troops came in, they basically scratched out the faces and the eyes on a lot of the figures. And so if you go there now, you'll see that they've not been restored. Well, one of the things that's important from a point of view of art and culture and literature in Dunhuang on the Silk Road is what's called the Library Cave. And there was a Taoist priest, Priest Wang, who was the guardian of the shrines at Dunhuang. Well, he discovered a cave behind a false wall that contained thousands and thousands of manuscripts. Wang was an admirer of the Buddhist monk traveler Zunzang. Remember we talked about him? He traveled from Dunhuang to India searching for Buddhist manuscripts. Once Wang discovered the cave, he closed it off again. The explorer Mark Arlstein convinced Wang to show him the contents of the caves by discussing the travels of Zunzang with him. He pretended, Zunzang, he pretended to be a disciple himself, and so convinced Wang to open the cave up. The cave contained literally hundreds of scrolls, banners, and paintings, Chinese Buddhist manuscripts, Tibetan leaves from the 8th and 9th century CE, papers with texts, written in Sanskrit and other indigenous languages, the oldest known writings in Sogdian, temple banners, paintings on silk and linen, and the Diamond Sutra, which I talked about last time, is the world's oldest printed book. And I apologize for the formatting of this. This computer doesn't like my PowerPoint. Here's a picture of the library cave. You can see all the scrolls and so on there. And some of the things outside of it. Well, I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about technology. And I want to talk about predominantly two things and then talk a little bit about science and math. The question came up a couple of weeks ago about gunpowder. Gunpowder was developed in the mid-Tang by the Song dynasty about the 13th century. It became weaponized, cannons were developed, and then once that technology had been developed, it traveled rapidly to the west. Here's an old Chinese cannon. Here's a smaller hand cannon, Mongol hand cannon. But basically, I pointed out before that the invention of the stirrup and the composite bow changed the face of warfare. Well, clearly that was nothing compared to what we see with the invention of gunpowder and the movement of gunpowder from China into the West. Another technological, scientific development was the development of the compass, and this clearly had a major impact on navigation. By the 12th century, the Song Chinese floated a magnetic needle on a piece of Russian bowl of water, marking on the rim that pointed to the points on the compass. This is one form of compass, the metal spoon, but here's the initial kind, this floating fish that basically points to the north and to the south. Islamic scholars, there were lots of them that we know nothing about. The Islamic Golden Age in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Al-Biruni was born in 973 in Khorasan, died in Afghanistan in 1048. Made several major contributions to astronomy and mathematics. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, was a physician. He was born in Bukhara in 980, died in Hamadan, Persia in 1037. Probably the most famous Islamic scientist in the West. He was a physician, astronomer, physicist, and mathematician, a polymath. He wrote a book called The Canon of Medicine, medical encyclopedia that was in use in Europe even into the 17th century. So he had a tremendous impact on medicine in the West. It was basically the standard medical textbook in European medical schools. Two other scholars, Al-Khwarizmi and Omar Khayyam. Al-Khwarizmi was a mathematician. He was born in Khiva, died in Baghdad, and laid the foundations for modern mathematics, introduced the Indian system of numerals, which had a zero, and the term algorithms comes from him. Omar Khayyam is best known as a poet, not as a pilot, a poet, based on his Rubaiyat, but he also was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. So these four guys represent important contributions from the Islamic East to Western civilization. They made tools, and this is called an astrolabe. It's used for navigation. I have no idea how it works, but they're very important. You can see here, this is Arabic here, but they're used for navigation. And a quick look, the final look at science. This is Ulugh Beg's observatory in Samarkand. Ulugh Beg was the grandson of Timur. He was an astronomer. This is the opening. This is what it looks like from down below. And somehow he was able, using something based on this, to basically determine the size of the Earth and the distance of the Earth to the Sun. Amazing things. This was in about the early 1500s. So major contribution to astronomy and astrological sciences. So there we are. Questions? I made it. Yeah, I'll repeat. Jay, would you turn on the lights, or Susan, would you turn on the lights so I can see? Yeah, Donna.
I just want to say that we have out in the courtyard garden something called an armillary sundial. And my data said it was used by the Greeks and the Chinese as an astronomical some sort of lab. It has armillary bands, and armillary bands were supposed to be armor bands that were...
I'm sorry, but I don't have a portable microphone. Let me come back to you if we can get a mic. No?
I was interested because my husband and I were at that observatory in Samarkand, and after his death, his work was basically destroyed because they didn't want to go any further into it.
Yeah, that's a good point. What Eleanor said was that the observatory on Ulugh Beg's death was destroyed. They knocked it down. Yeah, Gail? Yeah, I mean,
Throughout Islam, there remain pockets of the earlier religions, Judaism, Christianity. In the last few days, it showed in some of the towns in Turkey that were destroyed, the destruction of synagogues, as well as mosques and churches.
okay, what she's saying is that basically, although Islam became the predominant religion, there remain pockets of other religions. That's clearly the case.